The hospital gala had just called my name to receive the annual Excellence Award when Dr. Bradley Chen took the podium ahead of me, microphone already in hand, and told 300 donors and colleagues that the complication in a surgery I'd performed 6 months earlier had nearly killed a patient because I'd deviated from protocol under pressure. I was standing at the edge of the stage in the dress David had picked out for me that morning, the plaque with my name still sitting backstage waiting to be handed over, when his voice carried across the ballroom, and every conversation at every table stopped at once. He said it with the measured concern of a man reluctant to speak, but morally unable to stay silent, that he'd reviewed the case file quietly for months, that he respected my skill as a surgeon, but couldn't in good conscience watch me receive this award, while a serious lapse in judgment sat unaddressed in my record. Dr. Whitfield, the hospital's chief of surgery, seated at the head table, set down his water glass slowly, his expression sliding from celebratory to something far more careful. My resident Priya, seated 2 tables back with the rest of my surgical team, went rigid, glancing at me like she wasn't sure whether to look shocked or defensive on my behalf. A donor near the front, someone whose name was engraved on the hospital's new surgical wing, leaned toward her husband and whispered something behind her hand, and I watched the ripple of that whisper move backward through the ballroom table by table, until the whole room seemed to be holding its breath at once. A photographer hired for the event kept snapping photos out of habit, the flash catching Bradley mid-sentence. And somewhere in the back, I could hear a chair scrape against the floor as someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. I said Bradley's name once, quiet, the way you say a name when part of you still hopes the person will stop themselves before it becomes something neither of you can walk back. And he looked past me toward the donors instead of at me, like their opinion of him mattered more in that moment than the truth of what he'd just said. Priya found me in the hallway just outside the ballroom a few minutes later, my award still sitting untouched backstage, and asked quietly if I was okay, her voice low enough that the few staff members milling around wouldn't overhear. I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, that I was still trying to understand what had just happened in real time, the same as everyone else in that room. She said she'd been in the operating room that day too, assisting further down the table, and while she hadn't seen the exact moment Bradley was describing, something about his version of events didn't sit right with what she remembered of the pacing of the case. She offered without my even asking to write down everything she remembered while it was still fresh, in case it mattered later. And I found myself grateful in a way that surprised me, realizing how quickly people either quietly stepped closer or quietly stepped back once an accusation like that entered a room. Bradley and I had trained together during residency a decade earlier, 2 exhausted young surgeons splitting overnight call, so the other could sleep through at least one real night a week. And for years, I believed we understood each other the way only people who've survived the same brutal training can. I remembered him staying late with me the week my mother was diagnosed with cancer, quietly covering my patients so I could sit with her through the first round of scans without worrying about the schedule. I remembered assisting him through his very first solo cardiac case, standing close enough to step in if his hands shook, though they never did. And afterward, he'd hugged me in the scrub room and said he couldn't have gotten through it without knowing I was there. I remembered the 2 of us studying together for our board exams at his kitchen table until 4 in the morning, quizzing each other on complications neither of us ever wanted to actually encounter in real patients. I remembered the night we both matched into the same competitive fellowship program and celebrated with cheap champagne in his cramped apartment, certain in that moment that nothing could ever come between two people who'd survived residency leaning on each other the way we had. None of that mattered on that stage, under those lights, with 300 people suddenly wondering whether the surgeon they'd come to honor had actually endangered someone's life. The surgery itself, the one Bradley was now describing to a ballroom full of donors, had actually been a long and difficult one, a complex reconstruction that stretched past 6 hours, the kind of case where two surgeons leaning on each other's judgment mattered more than usual. I remembered the specific tension in the room that day, the patient's vitals dipping briefly in a way that made everyone's shoulders tighten. And I remembered turning to check in with Bradley exactly the way we always did during hard moments, a habit built over a decade of trusting each other's instincts without needing to spell everything out. What I remembered most clearly, though I hadn't thought about it in months until his accusation forced me to, was a small, quick movement of his hands near the surgical field that I hadn't fully registered as unusual in the moment, buried under the adrenaline of managing the complication itself. At the time, once the patient stabilized and the case closed out successfully, none of us had any reason to revisit that instant more carefully. It was only weeks later, once whispers of Bradley's version of events started circulating through the hospital, that I found myself replaying that exact moment over and over, trying to reconstruct with certainty something my own memory alone couldn't fully verify. What Bradley didn't know, what only the hospital's quality assurance office and my husband knew, was that the surgery in question had actually been a joint case, Bradley assisting as the second surgeon that day while I led, and the complication had occurred during a portion of the procedure where Bradley himself had made an unplanned adjustment to the surgical approach, without fully communicating it to me in the moment, a decision the hospital's mandatory operating room camera system had recorded in full. The same system installed years earlier, specifically to protect both patients and surgeons from exactly this kind of dispute. I hadn't gone looking for the footage after the case closed out fine, and the patient recovered well, since our quality review board had already cleared the surgery as a manageable complication within acceptable surgical risk. The kind of thing that happens in complex procedures without anyone being at fault. I only remembered the footage existed at all once Bradley's accusations started spreading through the hospital grapevine in the weeks leading up to the gala, and I'd quietly requested a copy from the quality assurance office just in case, never imagining I'd actually need to use it in front of an audience. The night the gala fell apart, my husband David sat with me at our kitchen table going through every detail of that surgery we could both remember, cross-referencing the timeline against the hospital's own case notes to make sure my memory of what happened matched what the footage would actually show once we got our hands on it. He kept a legal pad open beside him, sketching out a rough timeline in his own handwriting, occasionally reading a line back to me to see if it matched what I remembered feeling in the moment versus what the official notes actually recorded. At one point, David asked carefully whether I thought Bradley genuinely believed the story he was telling, that maybe stress or professional jealousy had reshaped his memory of that day into something that let him feel less responsible for his own choices. I told him it didn't matter what Bradley had convinced himself of, because the operating room camera didn't have a memory that bent under pressure. It simply recorded what happened, and I intended to let it speak for itself the moment I had the chance. David finally set the pad down around 2 in the morning, reached across the table, and told me that whatever the review board decided, the footage wasn't going to change no matter how many times Bradley told the story differently. 3 days before the hospital's internal review board convened to address the growing dispute, an email arrived from a former surgical nurse named Carla, someone who'd assisted on dozens of our joint cases over the years, before transferring to a different hospital system entirely. She said she'd heard through a mutual colleague what had happened at the gala and wanted to share something that had bothered her for a long time, unsure whether it was her place to say anything since she no longer worked with either of us. She said that during a different complicated case years earlier, she'd overheard Bradley admit privately to another attending physician that he sometimes made adjustments mid-surgery, without flagging them clearly to the lead surgeon because, in his words, asking permission mid-procedure made him look less confident in front of residents, and that he figured the outcomes usually worked out fine either way. She said she'd carried that conversation around for years without quite knowing what to do with it, telling herself it wasn't her place to report something secondhand that hadn't caused visible harm at the time, and had nearly let the memory fade entirely until the news about the gala reached her through an old coworker's message. She said she'd never reported it because nothing had gone wrong in that particular case. But hearing about the accusation against me made her wonder if the same habit had quietly caused the very complication he was now blaming entirely on someone else. She said if it would help, she was willing to put that account in writing for the review board. The internal review board meeting was tense from the moment everyone sat down. Dr. Whitfield present alongside 2 outside surgeons, brought in specifically because of how publicly the accusation had unfolded. Bradley repeated his claim, calmer now, more rehearsed, describing the moment of complication in language that placed the deviation from protocol entirely on my instructions during the procedure. I let him finish completely before saying anything because I wanted the board to hear his full account before I began setting the actual footage beside it. Then the quality assurance director played the operating room recording for the room, time-stamped and unedited straight from the hospital's own secure archive, showing clearly that it was Bradley's hands, not mine, that had made the unplanned adjustment to the surgical approach in the exact window before the complication occurred, with my own recorded voice on the footage asking what he was doing just seconds before things went sideways. Bradley said the footage didn't capture the full verbal context of the moment, that split-second decisions in surgery don't always look clean on playback. And for a moment, one of the outside surgeons looked briefly sympathetic to that argument, since operating room footage can genuinely be difficult to interpret without full context. The quality assurance director offered to replay the segment a second time, slower, with the recorded audio isolated. And even at half speed, the sequence of hands and decisions matched exactly what I remembered, my own voice audibly asking what he was doing a beat before the complication began. One of the outside surgeons leaned forward, asking the director to freeze the frame at the exact second before the adjustment, studying the positioning carefully before nodding slowly to herself. The kind of small gesture that told me she'd seen enough to form her own opinion regardless of what Bradley said next. Dr. Whitfield asked Bradley directly, without any softness left in his voice, whether he had communicated the adjustment to me verbally before making it, and Bradley said he'd assumed it was implied given the circumstances. an answer that visibly did not satisfy anyone still watching the frozen frame on the screen behind him. That was when Carla's written statement was read aloud to the board, describing Bradley's own past admission about making unflagged adjustments mid-surgery because it made him look more confident. The room went completely still, except for the soft hum of the projector fan. I watched Dr. Whitfield's face carefully as the statement was read, the way his jaw tightened at certain phrases, and I realized in that moment that he was hearing, for the first time, a version of Bradley that clashed entirely with the confident, reliable colleague he'd vouched for in countless hospital committee meetings over the years. Bradley's expression shifted the way a person's does when they realize a private habit they assumed nobody had ever noticed has just resurfaced in front of the only people whose judgment could actually affect his career. He said the statement was secondhand, unverifiable, taken out of context from a private conversation years earlier. But Dr. Whitfield asked flatly whether he denied ever saying anything like that to a colleague, and Bradley didn't answer the question directly at all. One of the outside surgeons asked quietly whether this meant the pattern described might extend to other cases across Bradley's career that had never been closely reviewed, and Dr. Whitfield said that given what had just been heard, the hospital's quality assurance office would need to open a broader retrospective review of his surgical history going back several years. Bradley gathered his folder without another word and left the room, and nobody moved to stop him. The fallout moved through the hospital slowly but completely over the following months. The board placed Bradley on a restricted surgical schedule pending the full retrospective review, and within the semester, he accepted a quiet transfer to a smaller regional hospital rather than continue practicing under the scrutiny that review had created. Two other surgeons who had trained under him years earlier came forward separately once word spread, describing similar concerns about unflagged mid-procedure adjustments that had never been formally reported at the time. A regional surgical conference that had booked him to lead a workshop on advanced technique that spring quietly replaced him on the program, without much public explanation. The kind of change everyone in the medical community understood exactly how to read. A medical journal that had featured a profile piece on Bradley the previous year, praising his steady hands under pressure, quietly issued a brief editor's note, acknowledging that circumstances surrounding the original story had since changed, without elaborating further. The state medical board opened its own inquiry once the hospital's findings were formally filed, a process that would likely take years to fully resolve, but that effectively ended any near-term chance of Bradley advancing to a leadership role anywhere in the region. Even so, a handful of longtime colleagues who'd always liked Bradley personally struggled to fully reconcile the version of him described in the review with the man they'd known for years, and I understood that some loyalty, once built over a decade of shared exhaustion and shared training, doesn't fully disappear just because the truth comes out clearly. Bradley reached out to me by letter nearly 2 months later, handwritten rather than typed, the same careful handwriting I remembered from years of shared call notes, saying he was sorry, that a decade of quietly making unflagged adjustments without consequence had convinced him somewhere along the way that his instincts were simply better than the protocol required, and that he'd never truly examined how dangerous that quiet confidence had become until it finally caught up with him in front of people whose opinion he couldn't control. He wrote that he'd started attending a physician support group for the first time in his career, something he said he'd have scoffed at years earlier, and that hearing other surgeons describe similar quiet patterns of overconfidence had been the first thing that made the shame feel survivable rather than something to keep hiding from. He said the hardest part hadn't actually been the review board or the transfer, but the quiet moment his own son had asked him, after seeing something online, whether it was true that he'd hurt someone, and not having an honest answer ready that a child could understand. He said he genuinely believed, in some distorted way he couldn't fully explain even to himself, that accusing me first at the gala would protect the career he'd built, and that he understood now how badly that instinct had cost both of us, far more than either of us could have predicted walking into that ballroom. I read the letter twice and didn't respond right away. When I finally did, I told him I appreciated the honesty, that I didn't fully understand the choice he'd made, and that I hoped whatever came next for him involved genuinely examining it, rather than simply relocating quietly the way his transfer had let him do. The unexpected part came the following year, when Dr. Whitfield privately suggested that given how publicly the dispute had unfolded, taking the department's chief surgical fellowship position I'd been quietly considered for would likely go smoother if I built my leadership case somewhat separately from the case that had made me publicly known throughout the hospital, at least for a while, rather than having every future decision quietly measured against the gala story. It wasn't the outcome I wanted, watching a complicated, entirely defensible surgery become the thing my name got attached to hospital-wide instead of the years of careful, unremarkable work that actually defined my career. But within the year, I accepted the fellowship anyway, built my leadership case on new cases entirely. And David sat beside me the night I was formally announced as Chief Surgical Fellow, squeezing my hand the way he had through every hard year leading up to it. My mother calling the next morning to say she'd already told half her book club before I'd even had a chance to post anything about it myself. Sometimes late at night, I still think about the version of the story where Bradley never said anything at that gala, where the two of us kept working side by side the way we always had, still splitting overnight calls the way we did back when neither of us could survive residency alone. And I remind myself that proving the truth cost me a decade-long friendship, but staying quiet would have cost me my own record instead. I still keep his old handwritten letter tucked in a drawer at home, not because I've decided what to do with the friendship yet, but because some part of me isn't ready to treat a decade of trust as something I can simply throw away over a single, however serious mistake. Priya still works with me most days now, and every so often, in a hard case, she'll glance my way exactly the way I used to glance at Bradley, and I find myself grateful all over again that some things, once broken, can still find a way to be rebuilt with someone new. If you've ever had someone who shared your hardest years, try to save themselves by rewriting what actually happened. You know that winning doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it just feels like finally being able to stand on solid ground again. If this story hit home for you, hit like and subscribe because there's another one coming next week.